Without electricity, transformation of economy and the coming out of poverty is impossible. Energy is everything.
The smoke is the main issue here. There's no vent, no window opening.
But you can hear the kids, you can hear their lungs, you can hear the... Electricity's not working.
The Achilles heel to all of these mini-grid systems is the battery. The more time the ceiling fans are running, the bigger the battery has to be.
Capacity is around 6.3 gigawatts.
So that's 6 or 7 nuclear reactors.
Vâng, chính xác. Bởi vì than là cuộc sống của rất nhiều người ở đây, nên chưa từ bỏ được ngay ạ.
Black gold.
There's mobile technology that's allowing all of this
Absolutely.
to
Yes.
happen.
Yes.
Got it.
Once they saw this gas coming in, people decided to switch.
So this is sort of what it was, and that's the future.
That's the future.
We're very fortunate. We can choose what we do when we use power. We want to give people that choice. We want to give people that freedom.
Than là bây giờ
There's some ideas here.
We hope that our children will be better than us.
We all hope.
Hello, I'm Rob, the Deputy Director of Science and Technology of the MIT Energy Initiative. We've just seen a trailer for Switch On, and many of you have viewed the full-length documentary of the film on YouTube over the last week. I'm here with its maker, Dr. Scott Tinker, a professor at UT Austin, the Director of the Bureau of Economic Geology, and the State Geologist of Texas, and now the maker of 2 feature-length documentaries as founder of the nonprofit Switch Alliance. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks, Rob. Great to be here.
With Scott is Ernie Moniz, former Secretary of Energy in the Obama administration and the founding director of the MIT Energy Initiative, where I work, and my colleague once again at MIT. Welcome, Ernie. We're going to be together for the next 90 minutes, and we'll give you a chance to ask questions in the last half hour, and I invite you to send them at any time via the Q&A window. We have a couple of people who'll be reading them and formulating maybe bigger questions from what you send along, but please do send them at any time. Ernie, I should also say, is the CEO of the Energy Futures Initiative and the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And from my perspective, more importantly, he's the co-chair, along with Raj Shah, the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and Akin Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank, of the Global Commission to End Energy Poverty, on which I also serve. Ernie, the commission is involved in a lot of the themes in Scott's film, and I wonder, just before we get going, since in part this is a shameless advertisement for our forthcoming final release event, you could just tell us a little bit about what the commission is doing and what you're trying to do.
Sure. Thanks, Rob. Actually, I think Scott's film could be like the first chapter of the Global Commission's report. But I think the history here that's worth repeating is that what I would say is that Raj Shah, who was my colleague in the Obama administration when he headed AID, and by the way, I might add that the president had us peeling vegetables together at a food kitchen in Washington D.C. when we were in the government. But Raj, now as head of the Rockefeller Foundation, is well. He was, of course, at AID, and he's always been very, very dedicated to alleviating poverty. And what I would say is that he is correctly convinced that a key to addressing the overall poverty and development issues is to address energy poverty. And so the commission that you described, which I co-chair, mainly because you and your team are the actual workers on the study, have been examining the energy poverty. Our first report will focus mainly on electricity systems, electricity access as critical, and clearly Scott's film that we'll be discussing and that he'll be discussing brings out very vividly those electricity challenges, and I would say the commission's future work, like on the cooking issues, the mobility issues, the industrial development issues, but probably electricity and then cooking, I would say, is what really hits me from particularly from seeing Scott's film.
Thanks. So we'll hit those issues today, I think, in viewing a couple of clips and then having a discussion. Before we get going, let me return to Scott. And Scott, help us out here. How did the state geologist of Texas ended up making a movie about energy poverty in the developing world? What's been your trajectory and what are you trying to accomplish?
Thanks, Rob. And Ernie, thanks for the nice words too. Yeah, I'm a geologist. I was in the oil and gas business actually 17 years, and I came out of UT just over 2 decades ago, and run an organization that looks at energy and the environment and the economy and all those things come together, kind of a practical research organization, and that led me to thinking about big global issues with energy. And we made our first film, Switch, filmed in 2009 and 10, and then post-production 11, we released it in 2012. And Secretary Moniz features quite prominently in that film. He and I were on a board together at that time and got to know him quite a bit better. So that film called Switch looks at global energy. And we tried our best to do it in a nonpartisan, critical thinking way, just the pros and cons of different energy in their best light around the world, went to 11 countries, etc. I think we accomplished it pretty well. It still plays heavy in over 50 countries and universities globally. It passed 15 million viewers for that film, which is a big deal. But along the way, the filmmaker, Harry Lynch, my partner, is actually the brains. I'm just a pretty face, you know. He said, he was working on a whole series on mental health, a mental health channel, really nice piece. And I was blathering away on energy still and realized that more and more we had left out a large number of people and a really significant set of issues globally. And that's the access issue, or the energy poverty, or energy inequality in many ways issue. Got back with Harry and said, we got to make another film, and he agreed. That's when we formed the Switch Energy Alliance and went off to different countries this time, looking really at several big forms of lack of access into energy or energy poverty that are featured in the film. So that's kind of my trajectory, Rob, and I've been lucky to be in 65 countries in the world throughout my career, very fortunate, but have seen this in a lot of different ways and different forms. And it's a big, look, it's a big set of challenges. If we really would have solved it, it's not easy. But that's where I am today, and really appreciate what you all are doing and the opportunity to be here with you today.
I assume this is a huge crew you travel around with, given the high quality of the production. Is that right? You fill a plane?
No. I raise the money, so that limits the crew size. It's quite small. We have 2 cameras. We have sound. We usually have somebody called a fixer in country where we go, and then a lot of local people. We hire local lights if we need them. So it's pretty small. We're not staying in fancy places. Especially in this film, there aren't fancy places quite often. So no, it's small, but I appreciate the comment on quality, because this hit Switch and this film both are IMAX quality. They have original scores. They have that kind of color depth and really high density. So they play on an IMAX capable screens, and we try our best to make them look and feel very professional. We want them to stand the test of time. And again, nonpartisan isn't easy. I have biases, we all do. But if you can cross that gap, you won't get the high drama spike of some other documentaries, but you stand the test of time a lot more, and that's our goal.
Congratulations again on a really beautiful couple of films.
Thank you.
And I think your personality comes through as well in the delivery.
Oh,
You know, the issues you address very early on in the film is the sort of divergent scales of energy. You've got big energy, giant dams and transmission lines, and then very small energy in the slums and in very rural areas in Colombia. One of the points you pick up on very early is the challenge of providing energy to provide for household needs, which is a sort of a social welfare issue, and the idea of powering whole economies. And these are economies that are struggling, and there's an emphasis in many of these countries on getting economic activity going. And you end up in what for me was kind of an uncomfortable conversation beneath the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia with an engineer who was sort of justifying the taking of land to create a dam on the basis of aiding national interests. And he was talking about the people sort of wasting the land. And it's a theme that came up again when you were talking with a woman in, I think, Kenya, about her concerns about the poor people in cities not always coming out on the right end of the deal in these big energy projects. We're talking about hydros again and the expanding grid. We actually had a clip on that one, and I wonder if we could show it now, just to get the issues back out.
Sure.
Roll them.
In Africa, most of the electricity goes to industry and to urban centers. We don't have a very huge network, grid network,
Right.
to meet and supply
For the distribution.
everyone.
But a major dam like that produces a tremendous amount of steady electricity. But you're saying it disproportionately benefits those who are in cities that can benefit it compared to those who are displaced.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would build dams where there's no or minimal displacement of people.
Yeah.
Generally, they lose a source of livelihood. They lose their social cohesion and become disoriented. Energy distribution is, I think, follows a model which was left by the colonialists, where they supplied services and resources to the few urban people, leaving out the majority who in Africa tend to live in the rural areas.
Interesting.
So that's one point of view. And I have to say, in my adventures in Africa, I haven't really encountered that point of view very often. How typical it was of what you saw and experienced.
Yeah, I agree. We like to feature multiple perspectives, and that's one, and occasionally, but you know, when we actually were in Ethiopia, for example, at the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and we went to a displaced village, the attitudes there were quite different of the villagers that we visited with, and the opportunities not only that they had, people my age, but their kids and grandkids. Now, with a school and a little police station and some health sector components to it that simply weren't present before, when they were literally living in the bush, as they said. So a very different set of attitudes on the ground that we were able to explore, and that's not just in Africa, that's countrywide. So there's always this tension between the individual, the community, and then the larger scale, and how do you balance those so it maximizes the positive impacts, while also addressing the scale, Rob, and that's such a big thing. Scale is such a huge thing in energy. We all know that, you know, you see the little installation we did down in Gunchukwa, a 3.5 kilowatt array, and then this 6.4 gigawatt Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam that would power 50 million people. So you're always balancing these things, but that's such an important piece of the conversation.
We actually have another clip that shows that dam, and it's a much more optimistic, almost sort of emotional story on the part of the engineer you're talking with, whose name I think is Rudo Sanyanga. So maybe we'll just show that and then come back to Ernie and talk about this challenge of big energy. It's a continental scale. Can we play the second clip then, number 3?
The country is leading toward industrialization.
So you'll be able to provide electricity to the citizens of Ethiopia.
And also we are connected to the neighboring countries. We are building a big transmission line with a capacity of over 1,000 megawatts to Kenya, which will be a venue to be connected to the Southern African grid.
Right.
It's not only for Ethiopia, I think it's even for Africa, the biggest, and it will be pride for Africans as well, not to Ethiopians alone.
Yeah, for all of Africa.
Yeah, all of Africa.
That's one big dam. And for those who don't look at the map of Africa every day, he's talking about shifting power to Southern Africa. He's not in Southern Africa. So we're talking about big transmission lines across many, many borders. Ernie, this is a topic that we're trying to deal with on the commission, and it's kind of challenging. And I can't say we've made great progress over the years in these sorts of trading arrangements. What's the position that the commission's taking in this?
Well, first of all, I think let me make a couple of comments on the scale issue, and because I think Scott and you both commented on it, and I think the film brings out these tensions, these between serving a vast underserved population with electricity, but doing so in an environmentally sensitive way, and also in a way that respects the social fabric of these communities. I think one interesting way of looking at it is there's an iconic graph of the electricity supply to people around the world and how that maps up with the United Nations Human Development Index. And what you find there is that the correlation between the Human Development Index and electricity supply, when it's very low, is essentially linear. So getting that electricity to people really brings them up that curve. And then when you hit around 4,000 kilowatt hours per person per year, you're kind of at the bend in the curve, and then it saturates. And the United States might be out at 12,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. Europe will be half that, but with the same Human Development Index. But the point here is sub-Saharan Africa, from, well, sub-Saharan Africa down to South Africa, which is anomalous in its development, you're talking here not thousands, not falling at 1,000, you're talking about maybe 100 kilowatt hours per person per year in an entire country. And there's just no way around it. That means that there is a huge development pathway to go along. I personally believe, and I think this is the way the commission is looking at it as well, that, let me say one of the, we haven't mentioned the words climate change. And as Scott said, in the film, there's, I think, a clear intent to avoid those statements that may be more controversial, et cetera. But I'm not going to avoid it because I spent a lot of my time trying to address climate change. But if we do not bring these people up the development curve with energy, ideally clean energy, but with energy, they are not going to be in a position down the road to be contributors to the climate solution. I believe that is essential. So I think it's also a kind of a patient outlook that we need to bring energy access to everyone, have them be able to fulfill the kinds of family life and economic activity that they would like, and at the same time be able to be partners with the rest of the world in addressing major issues like climate change. So I think there's no doubt that, and some don't like to hear it, but this development pathway with energy access really, in a certain sense, has to be the first priority. Let's help them do it as cleanly as possible now, but also invest in the idea that this is how they will be even greater contributors to something like that in the future. And I think that kind of is it's not said that way with the commission, but it's kind of the leitmotif. As I said earlier, as Raj Shah at Rockefeller sees it, that this energy access study is the key, energy access issue is the key to unlocking all the other issues to address poverty, environment, economic development coherently.
Rob, could I add to that just a little bit? Because I agree with what Ernie just said a lot. And for those who don't speak kilowatt or gigawatt, the average Ethiopian consumes 1/9 of the energy each year, a person, as my refrigerator. And the average Kenyan 1/3. My fridge consumes 3 times more electricity than a person in Kenya and 9 times more than an average Ethiopian. So this is that curve that Ernie is describing. And the paradox is energy won't lift you out of poverty, but you can't come out of poverty without energy. And this is the great paradox. And then there's another little paradox, I think, that is it's subtler, but it's just as important. Those 65 countries I've been able to visit, almost without exception, the dirtiest environments, soil, water, local air, are where it's poor. Simply can't invest to clean that up. They have other concerns. So there's another benefit to coming up that economic curve with energy, and that includes the other big pillars of the environment: the land, the soil, the water, the local air, in addition to the atmospheric emissions. And I think we've got to put that into that conversation to make it complete, because otherwise we look back at what we've done to our natural resources. And as a geologist, I spend a lot of time thinking about those. So there's this little energy, economy, environment waltz going on that is very powerful and very real.
Yeah, it's what mathematicians.
And may I now add to Scott's comments on my comments. I think later we'll probably come back to more discussion on cooking, but I think it's worth now, in this context, injecting the idea that when we have primitive approaches to cooking based upon gathered biomass, it's really a disaster all around. I mean, it's an environmental issue, it's a health issue, and also what maybe we need to bring out more forcefully is that it's a women's empowerment issue, and to have the development's only going to happen also when women have their capabilities utilized much more fully, and that comes down to not having to spend enormous fractions of their lives doing things like gathering biomass for what then becomes a health hazard by creating the indoor smoke. So it's these things really are so tightly linked in terms of development and, again, modern energy services unleashing potential.
I like to say that the present climate problem is the advanced economies, the US and Europe, China. The middle century climate problem is the emerging economies, India, Indonesia, where power systems are expanding very rapidly. But Africa really is the end of century story. Getting out in front of it by ensuring that the systems are there and being put in place to enable things like the Grand Renaissance Dam to play a role in enabling more intermittent renewable power to come onto the system. And it's key. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but these are large, complex systems, and making them happen would take decades. There's an interesting question here. I said I was going to take questions at the end, but someone raises the issue of LNG as a potential help here. In fact, you don't even need LNG in a lot of African countries. Many of them are producers of natural gas and domestic, potentially suppliers of their own domestic natural gas, which of course is another cleaner way, at least, than coal of powering grids. Did you see any evidence of LNG coming into play in your travels in Africa, Scott, or elsewhere?
Yeah, it's interesting. In the first film, Switch, of course, we went to the Rosgas Alpha facility in Qatar and featured that. And this was, again, almost a decade ago. Massive facility. I think at the time there were 3 or 4 trains. Now there are 7 or 8 or more trains. It's moving about 3 TCF of natural gas a year around the world. Big deal. And mostly to the east from there. China has LNG, of course, but where I felt it, and I'll start with Vietnam. We went to Vietnam and we see a coal story evolving to get affordable, available electricity, much like it has in China, and Germany and the UK and the US, and every other developing nation built on coal. And I'm scratching my head thinking, what are the options here for baseload or dispatchable electricity, if not coal? And we were wandering around ports looking at coal being moved up and down this long, 1,000-mile long north to south country, very thin, as they move coal from mines to barges back into power plants and steel plants, and thinking, well, what if some of these could be LNG degasifiers, you know? Why not? And that would be so, and it's not that far to distribute it inland because it's a narrow country. They're going to build 5,400 megawatt coal power plants in the next 20 years, 50. And probably more than that if you look at what their competing neighbors are doing, competing neighbors, to deliver stuff to the rest of the consuming world. That's us. So there's tremendous opportunities for natural gas in these places. Africa, to be sure, it's going to take infrastructure. You know, whether it's pipelines or LNG ports, or in some places tankers and trucks initially, and trains of various kinds to move it around. But it is, you know, no SOx, no NOx to speak of, not much mercury, not much particulate. CO2 to be sure, and methane leaks that have to be improved, but environmentally it's a much better option than coal for these developing nations. And you saw that right into the individual home, Rob. You know, when you go in and if you're cooking with biomass inside your home, as Ernie just talked about, and the health impacts on mostly the women and the kids can be instantly improved with natural gas, LPG, or an induction cooktop of some kind, or a biogas system. Instantly improved across the board. And by the way, it's usually more affordable. And I want to say that again because most of these countries now are not allowed to take it and gather it. The deforestation has gone too far in Nepal. So you're not allowed, you're buying it. In Sanu Kanchi's case, from a local furniture maker, the scrap wood, it cost her more money than an LPG canister would. So there's a virtuous cycle that goes on here that I think we have to get past a little bit when we think about fossil fuels, coal and oil and natural gas, carbon, hydrocarbons, hydrogen. I mean, methane is CH4, 4 hydrogens, not by weight, but it's a different fuel, right? And sometimes we get stigma attached to things that we stay with, not recognizing the important components of each of those things. And I've just mentioned a couple.
You go to right after Ethiopia, and again, it's sort of because we have this optimistic conversation about hydrogen, or hydro rather, and then you're talking to this very articulate woman about Vietnam's future, and you get this sort of, oh my God, look on your face, and you can see your mind racing.
That's because it was real. Like, oh my God.
Rob, let me make a note on the LNG question, but in some sense, LNG going in the opposite direction, namely in Africa, we are having enormous natural gas finds in Africa, both off the east and the west in Africa. However, I have to say that not exclusive, but the overwhelming focus of the international companies that produce it is in fact to ship it out as LNG. And I think we need a little rebalancing there of getting more of that natural gas used internally in Africa for development, some of the reasons that Scott gave, but also from the perspective that, look, in the United States, first of all, it is true that the majority of our own CO2 emission reductions has come from the substitution of gas for coal, but also we don't often enough focus on the role that natural gas has played and will continue to play as wind and solar penetrate more. You need the firm power backup, et cetera. And I don't mean wind and solar penetrating like we see them today in the United States. I mean, it's going up dramatically, and that's great. But I mean getting to 50, 60, 70% of wind and solar. And so I think going back to the Africa story, a little more development of that internal infrastructure would help their development now and enable an enormous increase in wind and solar, which is clearly a very, very important direction, I think, for them to go in. So I think taking this, I agree with Scott that taking this kind of system view is what we need. I'll also make another comment, not relevant to any question that's been asked, but I think that you mentioned, Scott, the tremendous planning for coal plants in various places, and Southeast Asia and Africa in particular. And, you know, a lot of those plants will be financed by China, by Japan, and China in particular. You know, we can complain about that, but, you know, I'm not big on complaining as opposed to doing something about it. And what we should be doing is providing the competitive financing to not build those coal plants, but instead build gas and renewables. You know, so but instead, in the United States, look, go back a few years. The Ex-Im Bank was put out of business instead of providing the funding and the backup for the funding that one needs to accomplish our goals. So we got to get ourselves also straightened out in a way that makes economic sense for us, but also accomplishes our climate goals broadly, and frankly, accomplishes our humanitarian goals, which has always been a trademark of our foreign policy.
In fact, Ernie, to add to that, in most of the countries I've visited, in some form or another, usually quite large, China have been present peacefully, unapologetically, and pervasively. In Kenya, we passed a massive facility as we were going out to film in the Maasai, bringing the 40-watt panel to power a radio and a couple of lights. A big facility with razor wire and electric fencing, and it was China building the railroad across Kenya. You see this country after country. Now, we can talk about the security implications of that. I said peacefully, but it's not just for lending money, it's actually also acquiring many of the world's mined resources. And you see now China with 60% of the lithium, 70% of the cobalt, 60% of the polysilicate required for solar panels, only about 15% of the nickel so far needed for all the batteries we're going to plan to make, apparently. And so are we moving a security challenge from OPEC for fuels to China for fuels? Because who controls the resources for those cleaner energies controls many of the cycles. And And I think this we're putting a lot together here, but that is such a critical component of thinking about access to energy and how it's managed and controlled. So I bring it right back to a very small set of examples. In the film, we didn't try to overstate this, but if you look closely, you see these micro markets forming. A woman selling cooktops in Nepal, induction cooktops. In Kibra, outside of Nairobi, there are lights in the streets now, and markets are open at night. And kids and women, who you mentioned exactly correctly, feel safer as they get educated and move around. In Gunchukwa in Colombia and South America, selling things out of a refrigerator to try to raise enough money to replace the battery on the array when it wears out. These micro markets are built by the local people. It's not what I would go in and say, you need to do this, because that sort of flames out. It's what they are doing to build their culture in a way that hopefully becomes a cycle of virtue and grows that way. It's really important. I get asked this all the time. Giving fish, teaching to fish. Apologize for the religious metaphor, but that's kind of where it comes from, is recognizing that each country has things, or each local economy or whatever scale you go to has things that they need. And if they build them and work towards them, it will be a lot more likely to be successful than if it's just dropped in.
Well, I think that the word you're looking for is entrepreneurs. And it's very easy to find entrepreneurs when you give them a few tools.
Right, exactly. Farmer John, and we featured with the couple of panels and his water pump, and now all of a sudden his whole yard was a garden, and he was selling food in the markets more than they needed. It's just entrepreneurial. Every single time you see that happen, it's phenomenal.
I want to bring it back to Vietnam and climate change again, and alternatives for economies that are sort of getting beyond this earlier stage. They'll begin industrialized and they're running out of alternatives. And again, your oh my God moment with this young woman, I thought was really kind of poignant as a way of framing it. Can we see the number 5, please?
We are standing in front of a building, and this is really kind of typical image of Vietnam now, with a lot of new construction. In the past, until now, hydropower is the main source. But from now until 2030, coal will be the main source, accounting for 40% in terms of capacity, and more than 50% in terms of electricity generation. We see that coal is a source of environmental pollution, including air pollution, water pollution, and also soil pollution.
Yeah.
We had chance to visit coal power areas.
Yes.
And I witnessed impacts of coal dust in this area.
So it's been hydro, but it's going toward more coal. Why is that? Why not keep hydro?
It's just because hydropower potential in Vietnam just used up.
So we've built all the dams that could be built for the most part, or at least the big ones. So you have to have something else to feed that up, that economy. Yeah.
So LNG is an option, which we've talked about. I mean, what about nuclear, Ernie? Should we be thinking about encouraging nuclear in many of these countries as they get more advanced?
Well, Vietnam has been interested in nuclear, but not at the tens of gigawatts scale that that we're talking about here. But more broadly, I do think that the next generation of nuclear plants could be quite interesting in the developing world and emerging economies. In particular, in this country and in some other countries, we are developing what are called modular reactors, much smaller than today's giant reactors, typically 50 to 200 megawatts. versus 1,000 to 1,400 megawatts. The big ones are supposed to have an economy of scale. Well, it turns out the construction mistakes also have scale and are much bigger with those bigger plants. The smaller plants also tend to have passive safety features. Some of them are also called nuclear batteries, getting even much smaller. And that means that things like the maintenance requirements, the operating requirements are much lower. So you can serve smaller loads. Also, for example, in Canada, your home country, there's a very strong focus on micro reactors in the 1 to 10 megawatt range. They could service remote industrial operations, mining operations. Frankly, Scott mentioned the need for minerals and metals in the new energy economy, and that's absolutely right. The World Bank has said that in going to the so-called clean energy technologies in the future, we are likely to need factors of 10 to 100 increases in the supply of various metals and minerals, some of which Scott mentioned. Well, if we're going to, so as he said, rather than taking oil out of the ground, we may be taking a lot more metals and minerals out of the ground. We better figure out how to do that with a hell of a lot better environmental footprint, not to mention in many countries, labor footprints and child labor footprints. But let me stay with the first for the moment. That's where, for example, these very small nuclear installations could replace a tremendous amount of polluting energy sources in something like mining, for example. Remote communities, communities in Alaska are very, very interested in this kind of supply, for example. So I think we could be having a paradigm shift in nuclear power away from the almost complete dominance of very large plants to just the opposite, smaller and smaller plants, as low as a megawatt instead of 1,000.
After you left this office, instead you went out to a coal mining community, just to pick up on Ernie's use of the word community. And this was part of the country where a lot of coal mining is being done, coal is being shipped. People are employed not only in mining, but in shifting it around and storing it. Building coal plants, it's an industry, and you begin to get the sense as you're filming that there's a real social problem here for them to move beyond coal now. That it's become so pervasive and so important in their lives, and they know they're dealing with these health issues. And it just it harkened back to our experience in this country and other countries where there are areas where there's coal mining and dependency of communities on the status quo. And it made me think again of our Ethiopian dam and what you're saying, Ernie, about the sort of end of century concern that if we don't get onto a cleaner track now, that we're going to end up with African countries ending up in just the situation that Vietnam's in now, where you begin to establish that sort of hard to unwind social situation.
You know, Rob, it's interesting. When I asked almost everyone we met with, had they had electricity as a kid? And most of them said no. The engineer in Kenya and Kibra said, no, I didn't have it till high school. He's an electrical engineer. Of course, in Gunchukwu in Colombia, they don't have electricity now. I asked the same thing to the young man who was taking us out to the Maasai. He hadn't had it through school, but just getting it now. When I asked that question in Vietnam, though, on the street, they laughed at me. And the actual translation was, what do you think we are, Hicks? Of course we've had electricity all our lives. And they were almost insulted by that. And so the tension is, yes, there are health issues with coal, but there are also health benefits from energy. And those I mean, think about the health benefits that we, in developed economies, we take for granted all the time. And so it's not turn off one, turn on the other. It's clean up this one. It may still be a great fuel. And I get a little cautious when we talk about getting rid of some kinds of fuels as opposed to the impacts of those fuels and how do we go about cleaning up, in that case, local air emissions, breathing, fly ash and having it everywhere, or atmospheric emissions, or the local water pollution, etc. You start to lose the dialogue with people when you say, let's get rid of all these sources of energy, and you'll go do these. That's a trickier conversation as opposed to what are the effects and how do we work on those? And I hope that's clear.
Yeah. Ernie, I know these are challenges that occupy a lot of your thoughts as well, thinking about social equity broadly. Speaking of health concerns,
yes.
And
yes.
Yeah, I know. I just wanted you to say that.
Well, no, actually, let me say, Rob, that because you mentioned, you referred obliquely at least to the fact that obviously we've had our major disruption in the coal communities, especially in Appalachia, and frankly, I think that those dislocations have not been handled as well as they could be and should be. And I certainly hope that we will, I don't mean now, but we will revisit that in this country, but also learn the lessons that can be applied elsewhere, because there's no doubt that the very low carbon transition that we think is absolutely needed does represent at least the risk of major dislocation of many communities. And as you well know, okay, I'll advertise it at MIT. We have another project called the Roosevelt Project, and that is precisely about now looking at 4 case studies across the United States at a worker and community level, and looking bottom up. How do those communities see themselves prospering economically and socially in a transformed energy economy? I think that we need to do this for the right reasons, in terms of being fair with people, social equity. But frankly, if we don't manage those problems, now I'm talking about the United States, we can extrapolate to other parts of the world. But if we don't handle those problems, we're just going to have political headwinds in trying to reach our climate goals as well. So, so I think it serves both our moral obligation and our self-interest in climate risk mitigation. Sorry, that's an aside, but I think it's quite
it's a welcome aside, and it's the one I wanted. It took you a while. I mean, to come up with the right answer, but your work with the Roosevelt Project, exactly.
I just didn't want to shamelessly advertise the way Scott is for his film.
Right. We're doing a very bad job in this country, and perhaps in others as well, of governing our way through this transition and exhibiting empathy and recognizing that eggs are going to be broken in the process of making these transitions. I grew up in a mining community in northern Canada, as you pointed out, where they mined nickel. But they recognized that 50 years farther on, there was going to be a problem when that nickel began to run out and other competitive sources developed around the world. Let's begin to develop a more diversified country, and they did it, or a community, and they did it in a very intentional way over a long period of time, and the place survived.
Mm-hmm.
Abruptness doesn't work. But there are places where abrupt changes are needed.
Promotion, Rob. I do have to say I donate my time, and my wife and I actually have given a lot of money to these films. It's my night job. We don't sell them. They're free to everyone, and we don't make any money on them. I would shamelessly promote other things I do at UT. but the film doesn't have any upside.
No, it doesn't. But here's an easy transition that it mystifies me. Cooking. I mean, you referred to it, both of you, several times, and we finally kind of a point where we can show our clip about cooking in Nepal, which is where you really begin to focus on it. Although smoke keeps rearing its ugly head in other situations as well, in Kenya, in Colombia. But let's see this clip on cooking in Nepal, because it's appalling, and I want to try to figure it out. Can you roll it?
So people have been cooking over wood and solid fuels for many hundreds of years.
Yeah, thousands of years, and it's good because this allows people to boil water,
right,
and then give warm food, which is also helpful
in
terms of health. But the smoke is the main issue here, and so you can see there's no ventilation in the window opening, for the smoke to go out.
Amod and his team monitor air quality in more than 3,000 households in this area. The outside air pollution levels are about 50 parts per million of particulates.
So 2 or 3 times a day we're going to 900.
Yeah. When they're fire.
15 to 20 times the every day. It's just when you can hear the kids, you can hear their lungs, you can hear when they cough, and you've been cooking in your home all your life, like this?
खाना जिन्दगीभरि सुरुदेखि यसमै बनाइरहनु भएको छ? Yeah, she has always used biomass stove. She has not used any other modern fuel, let's say.
I mean, you can see the smoke, completely darkened rafters and the loft above us.
Yeah.
That's really remarkable with kids and things, the exposure.
Yes.
Through their lives.
Yeah.
You saw real health impacts of this in hospitals you visited and looking around the town, Scott. What was their rationale? I mean, you pointed out that wood was in short supply, as it is in many countries where they still burn a lot of biomass. And yet they're still burning biomass. The health effects were demonstrable. I think you pointed out in the hospital that more than 50%, or the doctor pointed out that more than 50% of his business was from people with upper respiratory tract ailments. Why aren't they moving forward? Why is that a stuck situation?
It's a couple areas I think to explore. Certainly, it's what they've always done. So making a change is different and hard. You have to get attention on that and options, and affordability matters. Then, in the cases we visited, LPG is now coming in. The natural gas comes from India on different distribution systems, all the way down to the bicycle that I pedal around with 2 canisters on the back to the final home destination. Induction cooktop, but you have to have electricity to do that, and stable, and then have a way to pay for that. And so mobile technology, whether it's through chits of some kind on the phone or whatever, you have to establish some sort of credit to do that, and you buy an hour. So that's what's typically done. Some of it is unintended consequences of leaving it behind. In India, in some places where they left smoke, the unintended consequence was that smoke was keeping out various insects, including mosquitoes that carry malaria. The malaria came back when you went to a cleaner indoor fuel. And now I'm trading malaria for these lung diseases. So there wasn't enough wealth to put doors on with screens and other kinds of things to keep insects out. And there's other things like that too. So that transition is slow, but it's very, very accomplishable. It's not complicated. It doesn't take a lot of high technology, whether it's a natural gas, biogas, you could make a system, or an LPG canister, or a plug. These things are accessible today. They will change lives, and for scale, those who were able to see the film, about 3 million people a year dying from indoor smoke inhalation, particulates of various kinds, and diseases associated with that. 3 million people. I think COVID has killed about 1.3 million so far globally, maybe approaching 1.4 all in.
Not every.
terrible, but 3 million every year with this, that's more than malaria and AIDS combined, etc. But who knew? And quite often the reaction I get from people who see this film is, I just didn't know this. We didn't know this. We thought that was just a few people in small, completely bush environments, not 2.5 billion in the world today.
Well, I think the point you're making is sort of brings me back to the doctor you were talking with, who was saying they had this enormous incidence of these ailments, and here we are, we've shut down our whole economy. People are hiding indoors because of 220 or 230,000 deaths in this country. It's not an insignificant number, but I mean, people are screaming and shouting about it and trying to fix it. And the reaction you get from that doctor is more complacent than I would have expected under those circumstances. He's not a bad guy, but it does point out just how he's become entrenched and accepted as a part of their life.
What you didn't see was there was a waiting room outside that small office. A pretty tough scene. We were doing a 2-camera shoot. I thought one was on the doctor and one was on the mom with her daughter. It turns out one had flipped to me. But in that waiting room outside, it was just packed with little kids just like that and mothers just like that. The hospital beds were full. So I think he has to treat it almost like I'm not trying to make an excuse for him, but he almost has to separate himself because it's a steady stream of case after case of the same thing that's so solvable. And so I don't think he was immune to it. I just think he was numb a little bit.
Certainly, obviously got to you at the time. You also point out later in the film to the potential dangers of cleaner energy sources, especially when you're visiting Kibera, what I used to call Kibera. I'm trying to still get used to calling it Kibra slum in Nairobi, and the illegal connections. Can we show that one? It's number 6.
Wow. So William, these are homes.
Yeah,
I see homes. 4 doors on this side and 4 down this side.
There are 8, but they are using illegal connection.
Oh. Hello. Yeah. I'm Scott. What's your name?
Dominic.
Dominic.
Yeah.
It's nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Thanks for letting us come into your home today.
Yeah.
And visit.
My business.
I can see you use a lot of electricity. What's this? What's this up here?
Token, but it is not completed.
What is it?
Yeah, they removed all sockets so that he can use for illegal connection.
Oh, this was Kenya Power?
Kenya Powers.
And it's empty?
Yeah.
And this is the illegal?
Yeah, illegal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it better for you for having Kenya Power or this cartel power?
Kenya Power.
Kenya?
Oh, this one is safe.
It's safe?
Yeah.
Have you ever had an electrical accident? Like you got shocked?
Obvious.
Yes?
That is obvious.
Okay. So it's not very safe.
It's dangerous.
You're laughing because it's scary.
Even now he's using at, you see?
Oh, I see. Yes, that looks
the
pretty
roof.
scary. I mean, tell me what happens with illegal power like that? What are the concerns?
You know, the cartels used to take live wire only.
Live wires. That's got to have killed people.
Yeah. So many people are dying because of that. Even dogs, cats, children.
Children.
Yeah.
So when it rains, everything is metal?
Even this house. If you touch this house.
Yeah, boom.
Yes.
So it's a real safety and security issue.
This is this giant slum halfway in between Nairobi proper and this very posh community of Karen, with lots of expatriates living in beautiful homes, lots of locals living in beautiful homes, and they're stealing power. And they refer to cartels, who I assume are doing the stealing for them and charging a fee. But they've got a big cost advantage in this relationship relative to the power company. Are those low costs being passed on to the consumer here, Scott?
Well, it's interesting, Rob. In some ways, they are. The cartel is really the government structure in these slums, so we think of cartel as a quite negative term usually, but not so much here. It's the way that these cities are run. That's the power structure, not elected, but so they pass on a cost. It's typically competitive with Kenya Power. You don't go for tokens or phone. You're collected from. But the safety concerns are the things that the cartel can't provide. Whereas Kenya Power brought in all those lines and distributed electricity, and then the cartel tapped around those legal connections. And by the way, just to let your viewers know, we've made 7 episodes from this film. We shot 500 hours of film for 79 minutes. So we go deeper into each of these stories, 7 different parts of the world. And we have one on Kibra. Very fascinating. We try to understand the different corruption and power structure here. I go back to Kenya Power and talk to their head of security and the whole company about this situation and get their position on that. And a couple other people I interviewed. That a lot of interviews didn't show up in this film, so we could make these detailed episodes. And so it's never black or white. It turns out there's a power structure, and then there's an electric system, and some safe and less safe, but affordability maybe better here than there. And then there's also risk. If you don't go along with the cartel, there is risk to you or your kids, and you know that everybody does from different ways. So it's not completely clear cut, but in the aggregate, everybody we visited with there, we spent several days, felt that the non-stolen electricity solution would be better. The challenge then is, how do you work with the cartels, the local power structure, so that there's a win-win-win here? If you paint this good and bad, black and white, clean and dirty kind of thing, it puts people at odds with one another. So how do you co-opt the members of the cartel who are part of the community to get them control and power still and revenue, but also make electricity available to everyone, because that's the thing that lifts all the lives. And that was, I think Ernie was talking about earlier on in our visit, very important when we're stuck down here without the ability to come out because of access to energy. You've got to start to lift everyone that way. And that's going to involve a lot of compromises. A lot of what I call the radical middle solutions, looking at the data, compromising, not always being right, and not always getting everything you want, but getting some things so that the overall objective is addressed. And that objective, to me, is power to the people. It's affordable, available energy so that they're not stuck any longer. And it's not altruistic. I'm very selfish about this. I think it's bad for everyone on the planet. And again, Ernie listed several big issues. I'll throw a couple more in. When you start to think about population, fertility rates are tightly correlated to education. Education is energy access. Immigration and migration. Many of these countries are autocracies. There are autocrats, usually men, and they say they want power to their people, but they really don't when you look at what's happening. So how do you begin to educate and lift and get a voice? There's huge issues, rights and freedom of women, of course, and others. So it's not just about, the poor people over there don't have food and water and clothing. This is a global challenge, and it is the global challenge to me, because you can begin to address everything else if you unhook the bottom couple billion and let them grow into the places that we've all come. So that's the challenge, and I think it's doable, but it's going to take radical middle solutions.
Rob, let me.
So last topic.
Let me just add, since advertising is allowed, I want to go back to the Global Commission to End Energy Poverty, the report that will come out in a couple of weeks. Because in that report, representing a year's work done again by Rob and Ignacio Perez Arriaga and their team, for the first year of work, as I said already, it kind of principally narrows down to electricity access as being kind of a very high priority. But then it further narrows down, not exclusively, but principally to identify the distribution systems as, in fact, the weakest link in the entire supply chain. And so what you'll all see in that report is a proposal for how to organize the distribution system framework in these countries. And once again, not an either or. It's not like it's a isolated mini grid versus a centralized electricity solution. It's once again engineering coherent solutions that can in fact distribute electricity to every single person. So that's very much so the film clip kind of reminds one that it's not only the last mile, it might be the last 10 meters is an enormously important part of the entire energy distribution system.
Yeah, this cartel is performing a service that's valuable both to the customer and to KPLC, the incumbent distributor, in the sense they're at least willing to do the job and go into this rather rough place and work on the wires. They're not doing a terribly good job of managing the wires with these concerns, but you sort of get the impression that there is a tacit deal here that electricity is being provided, and perhaps they could be pulled into a business arrangement that would not be illegal and would still serve everyone's interests. So the last topic is really the other end of the spectrum. You're outside the cities with poor people in a different part of the world, but we could as easily be in Kenya. And in this case, it's with the Arako tribe in Colombia, a tribe, Scott, that you begin with and revisit several times throughout the film, living in a very remote area. And you go back to bring them a solar system that you assemble with your son and members of your team into a mini grid, which is an interesting thing to see. And maybe we can talk a little bit about what mini grids might do in areas like this. But let's see the film clip first, the last one.
We spoke a lot about sustainability, and the Achilles heel to all of these mini grid systems is the battery. So the more times the light gets used, the more time the ceiling fans are running, the bigger the battery has to be.
To wire the battery, we called in the professionals from Bogota. Every battery in every off-grid village is technologically complex and dangerous if not handled correctly. It may be the Achilles heel of the mini grid, but it's also what makes it possible.
Good work, fellas. As a battery, that's as pretty as they get. All right. It's in place.
In 10 years' time, the battery will need to be replaced. The Arwacos wanted this refrigerator so they could sell cold drinks and popsicles to raise $10,000 to $15,000 to buy a new battery when the time comes.
I assume you have one of those hats, Scott. Gone back there a couple of times.
No, but I do have one of those.
So seriously, popsicles? To you, an honorary member. But popsicles, that's the application here. I noted at the beginning of the film, you were very careful about asking them what they wanted to do. How could you help them? You didn't want to impose a solution on them. You wanted them to tell you where they wanted electricity and where they didn't want electricity. And it was a little bit surprising to me what they told you.
Yeah, they didn't want it in their homes. It's agrarian, and a lot of commuting that comes in from the mountainside, young kids coming in on mules and donkeys for school, but there's the village center there, and that's the case the larger Arhuaco community all around there, Sierra Nevada mountain there, many of these communities, we were in Gunchukwa. They come in for these events, and that's where they wanted it, in a kitchen in the local store. I put quotes for that. In the fans in the community center, and a couple of small places where they gathered for events, and a school. They were good with it there, but not in the homes. They didn't want it to change the lifestyle of their home, and so that was the choice. And they wouldn't accept. There's a beautiful river there. They wouldn't accept Pico Hydro. We talked about some micro wind turbines. They weren't ready for that. We weren't going to tap into power lines 4 or 5 miles away. It was really just the PV solar that was okay for their culture and for their environment. So that's what we brought to them.
It was enabling something that they couldn't otherwise do with cooling. That's hard to make a popsicle without electricity.
Yeah, that refrigerator. Some vaccines are in there now a little bit, and some other medicines, but also the popsicles. And you know, what a cultural treat. And I don't know what they sell them for, but they're trying to save that money up over a decade or more, as long as the battery stack lasts. They committed to replace the battery. That was our sustainability requirement, was, will you commit to helping maintain and preserve and protect this and replace it? That's why we had local Arhuacos trained by the professionals from Bogota to manage that system, both the grid itself, and we put the fence around, because there are goats running everywhere. There's a wire fence to protect it from getting stepped on, etc., as much as we could. I just checked this week, and it's still doing well. It's been almost 3 years since the install, and it's still doing well. You know, there's some other challenges they're having with their water now and access, but the electricity is still doing well. They're doing a good job.
Batteries are, as they pointed out, a big challenge in these sorts of systems. I live at a remote location here in Massachusetts where we all have solar systems, and you know, somebody makes a mistake every year. They'll leave a pump on or a fan, and they'll freeze the batteries, or you know, just pull them up and have to throw them out and start again. And it's expensive even for us to have to do that. And I wonder, Ernie, if what you're seeing in the future. I mean, are batteries always going to be the Achilles heel of these sorts of remote independent systems that could be so helpful in communities like these, but also communities in Alaska or on islands, for example, in different parts of the world? Of course, terribly important as storage devices on our grids. Are we making progress there?
Well, first of all, well, I think the answer is, first of all, yes, that batteries are going to continue to be very important in these applications. But we also should not be blind to the possibilities of having other technologies rather than, let's say, PV plus battery. We mentioned earlier, for example, these nuclear batteries could be interesting. A megawatt might still be too big, however, for some applications. But for example, another example I'll give is, now this may be a reaction different from what Scott just described in Colombia, but I've been in Alaska, where actually the Department of Energy really demonstrated an in-river turbine, which is supplying a remote village. No need for a battery, et cetera. So I think we'll see more diversity of technologies that can supply, but you know, they're all going to be very geography specific. For example, if you don't live next to a river with a considerable flow, you can't use an in-river turbine. Pretty obvious. So I think we'll see that diversification, but I think it's going to be absolutely essential to keep on this track in general. I mean, I think the example that we just saw is one of many examples where a very small amount of energy deployed in ways in which the community wants it deployed is a game changer for what they do. We saw that there. And another example it reminds me of from, I don't know, 15 years ago or something, nearly 15 years ago, when the MIT Energy Initiative was just starting. One of our very first seminars was with someone named Harish Hande, who was a real pioneer in PV and microfinance, PV battery microfinance in India. And he made a statement there which remains only half true, but I think it's still worth repeating. So this was like almost 15 years ago. He said, solar energy is too expensive for the rich, but very affordable for the poor. And the argument was, of course, because with solar energy, you could install a very small amount, potentially measured in the tens of watts, and be a game changer. Lighting for children to be able to read at night and all kinds of things. What's untrue, of course, is that PV has now become affordable for the rich as well, because the price has dropped so much, the cost has dropped so much. But I think that this push for these technologies that make sense in these isolated situations is so important as life changers with relatively little investment, frankly.
I made a little graph once of GDP per capita versus electricity consumption per capita. So the curve starts off, at 0, 0, it's practically vertical. The value of that first 1/10 of a kilowatt hour is enormous.
Yeah,
that's
well, that's the same thing I mentioned earlier, Rob, in terms of that Human Development Index.
Right.
That it's linear up to a couple of thousand kilowatt hours per person per year, and then you start getting into the bend, and then it's just flat. Using twice as much electricity, Europe versus the United States per person makes no difference in the quality of life.
It also goes flat on the GDP per person, though. You see that, and I kind of show that same graph, and then shifts over a quarter of a century. But you see GDP per capita growth without increasing much in terms of per capita electricity. In fact, some are actually coming down now. That's a good trend. We could do better, for sure, but coming down. Yeah, I do worry a little bit that we gotta be as candid as we can about the full cost of electricity. And LCOE doesn't get the full cost. A lot of people think it does, and they're using that to compare and say, look, this is cheaper than that. But we talked earlier about backup, and it may not be batteries, chemical batteries. It may be pumped hydro or compressed air or advanced capacitors or flywheels, a variety of nuclear batteries, hydrogen fuel cells. But all these things are redundant to that power system, that intermittent power system. So it's an extra cost. And to the consumer, they pay that extra cost, unless the government does, and then the consumer pays it anyway through taxes. So if you go look at where electricity in the world is quite expensive on the consumer basis, it's interesting to look at it in the United States, by country, et cetera. There's a lot of intermittent energy in that system. And it's tough to beat the economics and physics of having to have expensive, redundant backup that isn't used that often. And that's one of the great challenges I think we got to be as candid as we can about as we go forward. Lest people think this is just completely cheaper. Well, it is at the gate. But then there's something happens between the gate and my house. Okay? And we're all paying for that in the long run. You did ask if they gave me something, Rod. They did give me this. In Chukwa. This is the gourd that has the stick, and they put ground up seashells in here, and they pack cocoa leaves in their mouth, and the men activate the cocoa with calcium carbonate and stay a little bit numb all day long with these. And I was presented this as a gift. They don't give these away very often, but it was quite a meaningful moment on the last morning when we went up to a clearing where no outsiders have ever been with their village. Just a couple of us, and talked about they had written a big document about global sustainability. And through double translation, Arhuaco to Spanish to English and back, we talked about what that meant to them and how they felt the world was encroaching, but their young people were leaving. They're trying to preserve some culture and keep their young people in the village with that culture, but knowing they were going to need to make advances. there's no moral right or wrong here. It's morally gray. And I had a lot of conflicts with that myself all week long down there and the year that we went before. But I think in the aggregate, again, I felt that there's more positive than negative that will happen, and they felt that too. So that's it's not a compass, but it's a guidepost, if you will, that helps decide rather than who gets and who doesn't. We got to really think about that and how to deploy that globally. And I think your commission, Ernie, is probably all over that. Love to help in any way we can on that too, because I think we see that as well, just in the exchanges that we've had around the world.
We've got 10 minutes left, and there are quite a number of questions.
I just want to elaborate, Scott. Yeah, can I just make one point, Rob? Because I think it's very important. I absolutely agree with Scott that the unit cost of energy, whether it's electricity or diesel fuel, tends to be much higher when you go to a rural situation. There can be exceptions, but that's a rule. But again, a lot fewer units can make a hell of a difference in what they're doing. So I think it's as if it's a community that aspires to and in fact has much greater growth development objectives, then that unit cost becomes much more important than it is, I would say, at the beginning of the development.
You have to start somewhere, and that I completely agree. You start and you get going, and then it grows, and you go from lights and a cell phone and a radio to, a dishwasher and a dryer and the other kinds of things that have huge loads. That's why the per capita is so different, and that's going to take, you're describing very well, distribution and a grid. We have to have the blend there that goes on, because that growth will happen. It's happening in the 1950s in this country, in the United States. Look at the electricity demand U.S.-wide in 1950. It was very low. So it doesn't take long for that to happen. It's powerful. Sorry for the bad pun.
I think it's easy to get excited about microgrids, and I've designed a few microgrids myself and played around with ratios of storage to PV and so on. But it's easy to forget that on the grid, we benefit enormously from economies of scale on the one hand, but also the sort of stochastic matching between the loads and the diversity of sources that are available. And that helps so much to lower the storage requirement in order to have the same level of reliability. And of course, on a microgrid, you don't have the opportunity to use hydro in the way we can on a grid to mitigate intermittency as well. And so it's to me, the microgrid is sort of forced more and more into an important niche, but a niche, and one that probably over time will be mostly subsumed as the grid becomes the more economically appropriate choice for many communities that might in the early days be connected with the grid or with microgrids. We have 7 minutes left for questions, and a lot of them are really good. Thank you for asking them. We'll try to answer them somehow, even if it's by email later. But one I think we have to hit is COVID. I mean, we've come into a period since even you're making the movie when it wasn't even imagined that this could happen. But we've had a pandemic, and it's impacted people's lives in many ways. It's impacted economies in many ways. It's impacted utilities in many ways. With a lot of people unable to pay their bills. And I know that this is something that the Commission has talked about a lot, and particularly in terms of the opportunity that presents itself in the future, maybe to leverage the opportunity of building back economies and thinking in a more forward-looking way about energy systems. Can you talk a little bit about that, Ernie, and where we're coming down on?
Well, you've almost answered the question. I just comment more explicitly, though, that the facts on the ground today show the tragedy of the global economic impact filtering down and actually increasing the number of people without access to electricity, because some who have gained it can no longer afford it, as you've said. So kind of going backwards. But on the other hand, as you also indicated, perhaps there's an opportunity here. First of all, the COVID certainly exemplifies why it's so important to have electricity in order to be able to provide the public health facilities, for example, that one needs. So, as you said, with the commission, our discussion has been around can we it's a fact that nobody could really deny that pandemic preparedness is a global exercise. You don't fight against pandemics by leaving, let's say, a continent unattended. So we're going to have a concerted global effort to get a lot better prepared for pandemics than we demonstrated with COVID-19. In doing that, I think we need to take advantage of that, especially on electricity access. And I think that we can integrate that as a unified activity that really helps the development, but it also helps the global public health issue that we cannot solve, especially today with all the travel, et cetera. We cannot solve without bringing along the developing countries.
Last question. We've entered a new political moment. Maybe we've crossed the political moment. Maybe we're still in it. I'm not sure. But there's the possibility, at least, that we're going to re-engage with the world, and especially with the sorts of agreements that were made in Paris in 2015 to reduce our emissions. All of that takes money. All of it takes big wealth transfers, knowledge transfers. Do you think, Ernie, we're going to go back in that direction, and will it be in the same way that we did 5 years ago?
Well, we'll certainly go back in that direction. I think there's no question about it. There is still the open issue about whether the Senate, what the Senate majority is, which will have implications. But it's very clear that the president-elect has every intention of joining, let's say, in more traditional ways, rejoining various international institutions. And by the way, that starts with not relevant here, but NATO, for example, rebuilding that. I believe we will be right back in and probably expressing elevated leadership in the WHO. And on climate, it's clear that rejoining Paris is not viewed as enough. That's a necessary but far from sufficient step. That there will have to be a real elevation of the targets commensurate with all the science that we've learned just since Paris, in fact. And in that, it's very clear that this issue of the development and clean energy development in the developing and emerging economy world is absolutely central. So I think a big deal here is, and I'll just end by saying that obviously our relationship right now with China is very tense, very, very, very complicated on many grounds. But if I think back to 2015 and Paris, and even to 2014, November of 2014, I would argue that it was the joint announcement by President Obama and President Xi of China, the two largest emitting countries, that really paved the way for success in Paris and having every country acknowledge that it has differentiated responsibilities, but has responsibilities. I think personally, we need to rerun that playbook in the sense of you got to put aside all the disagreements. I don't mean put them aside like and ignore them. I mean, we have to keep working on those while we focus on the joint responsibility and interest in addressing climate change. China has just made its net zero commitment for 2060. The president-elect Biden has committed to net neutrality 2050, as has Europe, et cetera. And I think it's the U.S. and China coming together that again can give a big spurt to going beyond Paris, and that has to again include very, very centrally the developing countries as well as the emerging economies.
And Rob, can I say one thing?
Well, I saw another documentary coming on. I mean,
Hey, Rob, just say one thing in here too. In my day job, I actually give lots of talks around the world, 60 or 70 a year. And I think it's important to balance the as we've been talking about, the environment and the economy and energy, and also be as factual as we can going forward so people know the data. So under Secretary Chu, the Clean Power Plan was proposed, and it had a base year of 2005 when we were emitting 2,400 million tons about from the power sector in the U.S., a little less than half of U.S. total emissions. And our proposal was to go down to 1,600 by 2030, so a 32% reduction in that Clean Power Plan. We achieved that this year, 10 years early.
the hard way.
And there wasn't a Clean Power Plan. And that was shale gas replacing coal. Ernie already mentioned that. Renewable policy, mostly in the States. Some lower demand and efficiencies, but also something that doesn't help the atmosphere, which is offshoring manufacturing to other countries like Vietnam and China, who are emitting CO2 on a per unit product basis at much higher levels than we do. So this is kind of a little shell game that we have to get our heads around. But the U.S. actually, just in the power sector, not the other sectors, achieved what our Clean Power Plan set out to do a decade early. So that balance between markets and government solutions and energy, the environment, the economy, it's really important to keep in mind as we go back into the Paris Accords, what has actually worked? Who has actually accomplished, not pledged or promised, but actually done something. So as Chairman Xi builds another 120 gigawatts of coal under construction right now, it'll be fascinating to see how that happens by 2060, for example. You got to look at what people are doing in addition to what they're saying.
Maybe a new documentary.
Let me just add a factoid to Scott's. Absolutely correct. The electricity sector as a whole is down just about 32%. But within that, the large utilities, the so-called investor-owned utilities, are down 44%. Another lesson in you got to bring everybody along, the big guys and the littler guys as well.
Absolutely.
It's a nice way of bringing our conversation together. So I think we need to wrap it up here, Ernie. I know you have another commitment to move on to 3 minutes ago, and I suspect many in our audience do as well. But I'd like to thank you, Ernie, for joining us, and Scott especially for making this film and doing all the things you do gratis for the world in bringing these issues in front of us. And I hope you keep doing it.
I'd like to add my thanks to Scott for the film. That's great.
Ernie, thank you. And thanks to both of you for hosting us and all that you're doing too. Look forward to more conversations.
Look forward to hearing again from you. Bye, everyone.
Okay, cheers.